Recording. Okay, so now we are recording again after our announcements, and we will jump into our study. Can everyone see the church history slide? Somebody just unmute yourself and say yes or no.
Yes.
Oh,
Yes.
oh,
Hey.
great. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, so we're going to discuss, essentially today, we're going to look at Christianity coming to America. And it seems difficult to discuss this topic without addressing the issue of whether or not the United States is a Christian nation. This seems to be a topic that was much discussed in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. I think it is less discussed now because we think that there is a clear answer as to whether or not the United States is a Christian nation now. But certainly the idea, the question of was the United States ever a Christian nation remains relevant to many people. And it's an interesting question because I'm not sure how you would define a Christian nation. It's like the idea, well, is that Christian music? You know, what makes something quote unquote Christian? Is the fact that it has Christian in its name? Is it fact that it quotes the Bible? Does that make something Christian? Does something have to be overtly biblical and Christian in order to be Christian? And then I think more interesting, though, is the philosophy behind the question. Why would it be important for people to see the United States as having Christian roots? What is important about the idea of the United States continuing to be Christian? I think that is the real question. And, you know, when you take time to look at that, we begin to get to some of the roots and some of the real concerns of Christians today. But if we are going to look at church history, and again, this is in Texas. For those of you who are on YouTube, not a part of the class, and you happen to watch this, we're teaching this to a class in Texas. We are in Central Texas. And it is appropriate to think about, well, what is our particular history of our particular church? And so at this point, we're going to narrow our focus of church history even further. You know, one of the things that we've noticed is that when we're talking about church history, we're not really talking about world history. We've been talking about the history of the church in Europe, and in particularly Western Europe. We've not discussed church history much in Africa or Asia. We'll come back to that in a week or two just to kind of give you the bigger flavor again. Then we've narrowed it down more to Christianity in England. And now we're going to narrow it even further as we look at the history of the church in the United States, which means we're now looking at how Christianity arrived in the New World. And so we need to go back to the time frame at the beginning of class where we picked up our story of church history in the early 1500s. Well, we need to remember that as part of this, you know, we were talking about the things that gave rise to the Reformation. Well, during this time of the Renaissance, there was the age of the explorers. And so you had people like Columbus. You know, we always look at Columbus and how Columbus essentially is given credit for discovering the New World in 1492. Well, one of the things we need to remember is that one of Columbus's motivating factors even to sail was this idea of spreading the gospel. There was an evangelistic motive to Columbus. And so when he discovered the New World in 1492, he eventually returned on his second voyage. And this time, many of the passengers with Columbus were Catholic priests, specifically for the purpose of holding worship services and establishing Christianity among the indigenous people of the New World. And, you know, down here in the bottom, you see this is the Church of Hispaniola, which was the first church building. The one that you're seeing is not the walls are some of the remnants, but the very first church building in the New World was on the Caribbean island of Hispaniola in 1494. And so Columbus and many of the earlier explorers had at least part evangelistic motive. Now, it wasn't always that way, and there was a great deal of conquest going on for economic terms. And I don't think it's fair if we avoid that. You know, Queen Isabella, the one who sent out Columbus, and King Ferdinand, they permitted the encomienda system in the New World, basically slavery. And so as the conquistadors, as the Europeans were arriving, the indigenous people that they found, the Indians, were forced into slavery. Now, this was not the official position of the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church was against this. And so as more and more Catholic priests came over, there were attempts to change the slavery system, but it was difficult. I mean, you had Cortez conquering the Aztecs in 1519. At that time, the Diocese of Mexico City was created, which was the first diocese outside of Europe. Pizarro conquering the Incas. So again, you had this very mixed flavor of what was happening in Christianity in the New World, and this was primarily in Central and South America. On one hand, you had the economic exploitation of the people and the land and the resources. On the other hand, you had those that were trying to bring Christianity and were fighting against the slavery system. A couple of things to note: the first church in what we would call the eventual United States was the Mission of Santa Fe in New Mexico in 1610. So if you look at the modern borders of the United States, you know, the Mission of Santa Fe, the Catholic mission in 1710, predated the Puritans. 1769 were the California missions. San Antonio was 1718. So, you know, if you think of the Southwest United States, it was very Catholic. And you can see that history today. Now, as I mentioned, there were voices of protest among the official Catholic Church. There was concern because of the depopulation that was occurring because of smallpox and the wars that would break out. They were against this idea of forced labor and slavery. And Charles V, because of the influence of the Pope, remember Charles V was, during the time of Luther, established new laws for the New World. Now, part of the issue that was also going on that was played out in the Americas was the war between Spain and Portugal. And they were constantly fighting. And so in the lower right, one of the things you see is that they formed a treaty in the New World so that they weren't fighting over there. And they sent up a longitudinal line. You can see in red here. And everything to the west of that was, east of that was Portuguese, and everything to the west was Spanish. And so that's why Brazil is Portuguese, and most of the rest of South and Central America is Spanish, because of that agreement between Spain and Portugal. Well, the Spanish were not the only ones conquering and discovering the New World. You had the French Canadians. And so the French, which were very Catholic, they were up in Canada, and under Samuel de Champlain and Jacques Cartier, they established colonies in Canada, again, for both economic and religious purposes. And by 1689, there were 10,000 French settlers in Canada, most of whom were Catholic. So you've got to the north, you've got to the south, but let's take a look at the New World itself, what we would call America. And we are familiar with our history. The first English settlers in the New World were established at Jamestown in 1607. Now, this was essentially an economic venture. King James wanted to see what kind of crops, what kind of people could be found over there. Spain had been moving forward, France had been moving forward, and James, as part of European leadership, also wanted to establish a colony in the New World. So he sent over this group in 1607. Now, they were Anglican. King James was primarily Anglican, so Jamestown was Anglican, but the colony did not stick. Within 2 years, the original settlers had passed away and other people had to come along. But one of the things that you can see in the map is how they did follow the James River. And once they went farther inland and stayed, as well as staying closer to the coast, then you had the formation of these permanent colonies. But again, these were primarily Anglican. The ones that you learn in school, and even as I say that, the thought comes to mind. I grew up on the East Coast, in kind of the New England and Pennsylvania area, so we spend a lot of time learning about the Pilgrims. I don't remember what my kids were learning in Texas history. What I remember is that Texas history begins with Santa Anna and David Bowie, and that's basically when America began as far as Texans are concerned. So you may not be as familiar with the Pilgrims, but in 1620, you had the arrival of the Congregationalists. Now, the thing to remember here is that go back to English history and why we spent time looking at the Reformation in England. You had it breaking away from Catholicism, and you had the primary church as Anglican. Then within the Anglicans, you had the rise of the Puritans, who had Congregationalists, Separatists, Presbyterians, Baptists. You're going to see that repeated here in the colonies. But the first church was a group of Congregationalists who had set sail from Leiden in 1620. Now, they had gone to Leiden in 1609. These were Congregationalists who were primarily separatists. Namely, they held to Anglican, which was essentially Reformed doctrine, but they did not want to be under a state church system. They felt that the church was separate from the state and that each church was separate from itself. So they were forced to leave England in 1609. They developed a colony in Holland, got to the point where they realized, wait a minute, we want to form our own community. And so they left on the Mayflower and arrived at Plymouth in 1620. Their goal truly was to establish a Christian colony. So in contrast to Jamestown, which was primarily economic, the colony of Plymouth was primarily religious. And they had as their goal, and I'm quoting from the Mayflower Compact here, they had as their goal, quote, a commitment to covenant and combine ourselves into a civil body politic. So on one hand, they did not want to be a part of the official Catholic Church, the official Anglican Church in England, and yet at the other, they recognized that a community, a government, as it were, requires some sort of moral basis, and they wanted their community in Plymouth to be a reflection of biblical principles. Their motivation, again, in the Mayflower Compact is clearly stated that this was done for the glory of God. And so in 1630, they established the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Now, what's interesting is if we look at this, we can begin to see the religious diversity of England being reflected in the 13 original colonies. If we think about the Puritans, we think about New England. And one of the interesting things about this, hang on, let me just, okay. I'm going to back up just a little bit. I want to change my order here. So the Plymouth colony was formed in 1620, as we talked about. Now, as people continued to come to the New World, the religious diversity that you saw in England began to play out in the 13 original colonies. England was primarily Anglican during this time. We're talking about the mid-1600s. Think about our study of church history. Anglicanism had been established. Puritanism as a response has also been well established. You had the rise of the sects of Puritanism. Then you had King James and King Charles, who were trying to reestablish Anglicanism. So people were leaving England in order to either escape the forced Anglicanism or for economic reasons. So if you look at the 13 original colonies, one of the things that you're going to notice is that the South is primarily Anglican, and this is going to be reflected in a lot of the early universities. Virginia was primarily an Anglican colony. The Carolinas were Anglican. So as people came over from England and eventually from the continent, they brought their religious with them. Now, what's interesting about the Anglican formation of the South is that in 1775, the very first Declaration of Independence was written and adopted by the Anglican community in Charlotte, North Carolina. This Declaration of Independence, you can see echoes of it in Jefferson's writing in 1776. But it was the Anglican community, specifically in North Carolina, that felt it was time to declare independence from England. And so in order to produce more Anglican ministers, they needed a seminary, and so William and Mary was founded. And again, think of English history. Remember, after the Charleses, you had William of Orange and Mary. So William and Mary, the rulers of England, they were the namesakes of the College of William and Mary. In England, by this time in the 1600s, Catholicism was on the outs. And so the Catholics were being persecuted. And so there was a Catholic experiment in Maryland. So Maryland as a state was first formed as a Catholic colony by Lord Baltimore. And one of the things that Lord Baltimore emphasized was religious toleration. Because the Catholics understood what it was like to be a persecuted minority, Lord Baltimore, as part of the official founding documents of the colony, made sure that the colony had religious toleration. And so again, we can see that here in the South, some of the founding principles that were eventually became part of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution are beginning here in the South. So you had the Anglicans and you had the Catholics. Now let's jump back to New England. We talked about the idea that the Plymouth colony was formed by the Separatists and Congregationalists. Well, more of the Puritans came over to New England, and they were building this government, as it were, this civil body politic. And in order to be a citizen of what became the Massachusetts Bay Colony, you had to be a church member. So again, Massachusetts, and here you can see in this area, it was essentially a Puritan colony, and you had to be a church member. So in order to hold office, in other words, in order to vote, in order to be a governor or a selectman, In order to get certain licenses to conduct business or to hold land, you had to be a church member. Now, this made sense because as everyone was coming over, all of the original settlers were essentially church members. And in addition to this idea of citizenship, the church itself had a desire to truly practice what they thought religious Puritan worship looked like. So they eliminated anything that smacked of popery or Catholicism. So you look at the original churches and they were very plain. It was a plain building. The walls were generally white. There were no icons or statues. There was a heavy emphasis on preaching. If you want to go to one of these churches that exist today, Park Street Church in Boston, traces its lineage back to the late 1600s. Whenever I go to Boston, I go to Park Street Church. It's a solidly evangelical church. It is congregational. The building they're in now is not the original building, but you can see that they've maintained many of the traditions. Also, as part of Puritanism was this idea of industry. I mean, you think of the reputations of the Puritans have, and they were very hardworking. And so the colony was prosperous. They had a very strong value of family life. And so you had these families growing. They were very much dedicated to a pursuit of holiness. To the extent that Puritanism today is really a derogatory word. And the idea is that if you're having fun, you can't be a Puritan. Well, that's not true at all. But they were very much dedicated to this idea that if you are a Christian, then you should act like one and you should look like one. Now, it also had some downsides to it because there was no religious toleration in Massachusetts. Basically, you had to hold to a congregational approach to Christianity. Otherwise, you were going to be banished. And this was the official form of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Now, during this time, again, as the population begins to grow, they recognized that they needed a seminary. And so a seminary was formed in Boston by John Harvard, which became Harvard University. So the very first college, the very first institute of higher education was in Massachusetts, and it was in Harvard College in 1636. Now, as I mentioned, there was no religious toleration in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So if you were more of a separatist or if you were more of a Baptist, you were going to be removed. And so the New Haven Colony was formed in 1637. The Massachusetts Bay Colony needed more room, and some of those who were less they towed the line less, went down into what is now Connecticut, is part of the New Haven Colony. And we'll talk about that in just a second. But a couple of the other accomplishments of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, the first published book in the Americas was the Bay Hymn Book, which was basically the Psalter and some other songs, but mostly the Psalter put to music. So the very first published book was the Bay Hymn Book in 1640, which was what you would have in your church pew in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Again, there was not a lot of religious toleration. Quakers, who were fleeing the New World and arrived in Massachusetts in 1656, they were hung in Boston. And so along with this Puritan heritage comes a lot of well, I'm just going to call it was evil. Shouldn't have been done. And then you had the Salem witch trials in 1692. Again, this in their quest for a pure religion, they were not very tolerant. Now, the thing that really led to a significant downfall of the Congregational Church, of the Puritans, was what began to happen as time went by. Remember, in order to be a member of in order to be a part of the civic government, in order to be a part of the civic community, you had to be a member of the church. Well, as you came to the United States, most of the Puritans were members of the church through profession of faith. And yet what was happening as the colony began to grow and as they began to have children, well, part of the Puritans was where you baptized your children, and they were now members of the church. Well, as these children began to grow, many of them did not have a profession of faith. And so what you had is you had this growing division within the Puritan church of those who were members of the church by profession of faith and those who were members of the church by baptism only. And so now the Puritans had this difficulty because you couldn't be a member of the civic society unless you were a member of the church. But you really couldn't be a member of the church unless you had had a profession of faith. And so there were greater and greater numbers of people say, wait a minute, I'm a member of the church by baptism. I should be allowed to vote. I should be allowed to own land. And so they were. And so you had this development within the Puritanism of two membership categories. You had general membership, was basically anyone who was baptized into the church. And then you had full members. And those were the ones who were members by profession of faith and baptism as adults. And as a result, the church was being forced to recognize, acknowledge, and essentially, endorse two levels of Christianity, as it were. There were those who were Christian in name only, and those who were truly Christian. And so the church began to be watered down. The original doctrinal purity, the original doctrinal fervor for evangelism was, as you can imagine, began to wane in the late 1600s and early 1700s. And basically it's because the original generation was beginning to die off, and you had the rise of the second and third generations. Now, during this time, as I said, you had separatists that did not want to be a part of the strict Congregationalist church. And so Roger Williams was banished from the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1635. And he went directly south to what is modern day Rhode Island. And he founded a city there called Providence. And under Roger Williams, again, this was a church, like in England, that felt that in order to truly be a member of the church, you had to be baptized as a believer, that infant baptism or children's baptism was not found in Scripture. Baptism was only believers' baptism. And so that's where the Baptists got their origin in England. And again, that division in England we're now seeing in the United States. So Rhode Island was essentially a Baptist state. Roger Williams petitioned the king. At that time, it had moved to King Charles. And so the Rhode Island colony was officially a Baptist colony. The first Baptist church in America is in Providence. And it was in Rhode Island, again, complete religious freedom was practiced and was part of the official laws. Recognizing a need to produce more Baptist ministers, Roger Williams founded a seminary in Providence, Rhode Island called Brown. At about the same time, the New Haven colony, because of the growth, recognized it's awfully far to go to Harvard. We need our own seminary, and so they founded Yale. And so, you can begin to see the development of what became the Ivy Leagues through Harvard, Yale, and Brown. Now, during this period of time, let's continue to grow. If you look at the map here, you can begin to see the spread. We're here at Plymouth. Now this is getting wider. We're now including Connecticut and Rhode Island. Well, the English were not the only other people to provide settlers. The Dutch were settling, and the Dutch were settling in the Hudson Valley, and basically what, if you think about it today, Ohio, Indiana, kind of that space between the French colonies to the north in Canada, the English colonies to the central part of the East Coast. Well, in between that, there was a little bit of wiggle room. I mean, that's a lot of space. So the Dutch came in, and in the Hudson River Valley was Dutch. And so the Dutch Reformed Church was one of the major players in New York. And again, whoops, don't want to do that. The Dutch Reformed Church needed a seminary for some of its practitioners, so Columbia was formed in modern-day Manhattan. Within the middle colonies, as this began to grow during this period of time, there were Germans coming to the United States, and the Germans were landing in that space between Puritan New England, Anglican South. So in the middle colonies, you had a lot of Lutherans, and along with them came the Quakers, because remember, the Quakers arose out of the Anabaptist movement along with the Mennonites. And so they were primarily German in origin, and so you had a lot of these Germans moving into the middle colonies of New Jersey and Pennsylvania. George Fox was the founder of the Quakers in England. As the Quakers were being persecuted in England, they left for the New World. And those Quakers in Massachusetts that were being persecuted also went down to Pennsylvania. And William Penn in 1681 got a charter for what became Penn's Woods. Sylvania is the word for woods, and so Penn's Wood is Pennsylvania. And Pennsylvania was started, again, for religious toleration for both the Quakers and the Lutherans. Now, interestingly, jump ahead a few decades, and Benjamin Franklin from New Jersey, who actually was from Boston, eventually settled in Philadelphia. Benjamin Franklin saw all these Protestant seminaries being formed and felt, well, he wanted a university that taught education to the excellence as far as the liberal arts like the seminaries did, but without a religious affiliation. So Ben Franklin in 1740 founded a university that had the same curriculum, except it didn't have a seminary. And so thus the University of Pennsylvania was founded. That's where I went to school. That's where Patty Lynn went to school. So in Philadelphia, you had one of the first non-seminary based universities. So we've talked about New England. We've talked about the South. We've talked about the middle colonies. There's one other large group that we need to address, and that is the Presbyterians. Again, think back to England. England, originally Catholic, then Anglican. Among the Anglicans, you had the development of the Puritans. Among the Puritans, you had Congregational, Separatists, and Baptists. Well, you also had the Presbyterians. Remember, under John Knox in Scotland, and when Mary Queen of Scots came down and King James VI, you had Presbyterianism being brought into England. And you had Presbyterians spreading into Ireland. Well, if you remember, the Catholics of Ireland fought back, and so most of Ireland remained Catholic, but there was a very large portion of it on the eastern side, which is closest to Scotland, in the Ulster region, that was Scotch-Irish. The Scotch-Irish were very heavily Presbyterian. And so as these people began to come, primarily, well, it was first the Scotch-Irish. The Scotch-Irish came over, and you had Presbyterians that were part of the Congregationalist churches. Well, they didn't quite fit because they wanted a Presbyterian form of church government. The Congregationalists wanted independent congregational rule. And so the Presbyterians eventually kind of left Massachusetts. Rhode Island was full, Connecticut was full, and so the Presbyterians essentially got Long Island. And so the first Presbyterian in America was founded by Andrew McKinney on Long Island. And so in the Long Island area, in what is modern-day New York City, and in New Jersey, you had the development of Presbyterianism. And this was fueled by the immigration of the Scotch-Irish. Many Dutch Reformed favored a Presbyterian church government. And so the Presbyterians and the Dutch Reformed kind of got together in the New York area. And then you had the Huguenots. Remember, the Huguenots were persecuted from France. The Huguenots eventually left Switzerland and they came down into the North Carolina area. And so you have these pockets of Presbyterianism along with these other areas. Now, what's interesting is they also recognized the need for a seminary, so they formed the Log Cabin College in Neshaminy, Pennsylvania. The first president of this log cabin, this was a Presbyterian seminary, was George Tennant, which you may not know. The second president was Jonathan Edwards. And so Jonathan Edwards, who had been the president of Yale, leaves Yale in order to help this new college. Jonathan Edwards left Yale on good terms. He just felt that he was required more down in Pennsylvania. Edwards died after 3 months because he had volunteered to be a smallpox vaccination early adopter, and the vaccination actually killed Jonathan Edwards. So he was only the president of this log cabin college for 3 months. He was succeeded, however, by Aaron Burr Sr. So the Aaron Burr that we are familiar with through the play and the book Hamilton was Aaron Burr Jr. But Aaron Burr Sr. was the third president of this log cabin college. Moving forward a little bit, just so you get the full taste of Presbyterian history, is that, according to the Presbyterian church government, churches would form presbyteries, and as you had multiple presbyteries, you would eventually have the development of the General Assembly. Well, the first presbytery in the United States was centered at First Presbyterian Church in Philadelphia. The first General Assembly of multiple presbyteries occurred in Philadelphia, and we'll talk about when in just a little bit. And so Philadelphia was very much a seat of not only Quakerism, but also of Presbyterianism. Now, let's take a look at the colonies as a whole. As we talked about, as Puritanism began to grow, you began to have a watering down of true evangelicalism, true Christianity. And so you had the Great Awakening. In the late 1600s and early 1700s, there was a recognition that among Christians that Christianity needed to get back to its biblical roots. Again, think about the pietism that was occurring in Europe during this time. There's a lot of crossovers here. George Whitefield, who was with John Wesley, and they were influenced by the pietism of the mainland Europe. John Whitefield came over to the United States and began preaching primarily in the South. He was Anglican, but he was a very clear Christian, biblical, gospel living, again, we would call him a solidly evangelical, preached throughout all the colonies. And there was a revival that began to occur amongst the original colonies. Now, there was some concern among the Puritans that this was primarily religious, that it was not real. And Jonathan Edwards came to the fore. Jonathan Edwards was a congregational minister originally in Northampton, Massachusetts. Jonathan Edwards was wholly reformed in his theology and teaching. He was also wholly pietistic in his pastoral work, in that he was a firm believer that Christianity looks like something. We talked about this idea. Jonathan Edwards was a firm believer in expository preaching, in small groups, of shepherding his people. And what he recognized was that what George Whitefield was preaching was nothing other than what the gospel has always been and what the Puritans had always followed. And so he was a great defender of the Great Awakening. And so eventually the revival that was occurring in the southern colonies took hold in New England and in the northern colonies. In fact, as the Yale graduation class in 1741 was occurring, his graduation charge to his students was the distinguishing marks of the church, which is a very famous preaching and a very famous work by Jonathan Edwards that we use still today. His ecclesiology is developed in there, is outstanding. But as part of that, he defended the revivals and basically this idea of repentance, using David as an example, shows that no, revivals are very important. He looked at the history of the church and recognized that revivals have been occurring in church history. So Jonathan Edwards was really the linchpin that kind of ensured that the Great Awakening, the first Great Awakening in the early 1700s, swept through all the colonies. Now, that's not to imply that everybody in the United States became a Christian. That's not how revivals work. What it does mean, though, is that the church underwent, again, another reformation. This idea we need to get back to biblical truth. We need to get back to biblical living. That as the church had become more and more entangled with the civic affairs of the New World, it had lost its focus and it had lost its mission. And so under the Great Awakening, we see true biblical Christianity coming to the fore again. Now, we do need to look, and it's worth looking at the founders during the time of the American Revolution and the Constitution, because it's interesting. It's difficult to discuss church history in the United States and not address the political history. And conversely, you really aren't going to understand the political history if you don't understand many of the Christian underpinnings. For example, if you think about how the colonies were formed, well, John Adams and John Hancock from Massachusetts, they were Puritan. And you can see that in their writings. You can see that in their contributions to the early American literature, to the Declaration of Independence, to how they led, and eventually the Constitution. You have this idea of a proper body politic, of the idea of the importance of industry, the importance of moral living to the health of a nation. For those of you who watched the play Hamilton, Hamilton is beginning to get a lot more of the credit that he deserves as being one of the founding fathers. Well, Hamilton and Livingston was one of the authors of the Declaration of Independence along with Jefferson. Well, they were Dutch Reformed. People look at the play and wonder, was Hamilton a believer? If you read the book and if you read his biography, Hamilton was Dutch Reformed. His wife, the Schuylers, were very much practitioners of the Dutch Reformed faith, and many of Hamilton's writings reflect this idea of his faith, which seems genuine and follows the Dutch Reformed way of thinking. You think of George Washington. George Washington was Anglican. I'm going to talk about James Madison in just a second. James Madison was the fourth president. Madison's denominational affiliation is somewhat in question. Not that he was not quote unquote Christian, but on one hand, he was very Anglican, but we're also going to see another major influence. Roger Sherman, another signer of the Declaration of Independence. Roger Sherman was another person who also helped write it. He was Baptist. He was from Connecticut. And so you've got the Puritans, the Dutch Reformed, the Anglicans, and the Baptists. Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin were deists. And so while there is a Christianity to them, you would not say that they were evangelical Christians. And then a person who I want to kind of focus on here at the end, because I think his story brings a lot together, is John Witherspoon. John Witherspoon was from Scotland, and he was Presbyterian trained. Oops, go back. He was Presbyterian trained, and he was sent to the New World. He was sent to America in order to take over the Log Cabin College, which now had become the College of New Jersey. The Log Cabin College had grown. It had gone through 4 presidents. There was a need for a Presbyterian seminary in the United States. And so John Witherspoon and his wife Elizabeth were convinced to move to New Jersey and to continue this College of New Jersey. I don't think I'm giving away too much of the story. The College of New Jersey is Princeton University. And so it became a major university in the United States. Now, what's interesting about Witherspoon is because Witherspoon is and primarily should be seen as a Presbyterian pastor, a Presbyterian minister. That was his training, that was his heart, that was his activity. But one of the things that Witherspoon did as a pastor and as a college president was he preached. And Witherspoon was a firm believer on the rightness of the American cause of independence. Witherspoon was what you would call a strict Calvinist. And under Calvin's theology, if a leader was a tyrant, then it was the right and almost the responsibility of the tyrant subjects to rise up and overthrow the tyrant. And that was one of the things that Witherspoon preached. He preached independence based on Calvin's theory of tyranny. And in fact, you can see the word tyranny used frequently in the Declaration of Independence. That was a theological basis to justify the rising up against an appointed leader. Now, as you can imagine, not everybody, not all Christians in the American colonies agreed with Witherspoon. You can make a very strong biblical argument that leaders are appointed by God and that it is appropriate for the subjects to follow them. And so not all solidly evangelical, gospel-believing, Bible-preaching Christians were for independence. Many of them were what we would call loyalists, believing that Scripture taught you don't overthrow a God-appointed leader. But Witherspoon was on the other side of that. Witherspoon eventually was appointed a delegate to the Constitutional Convention. He was the only pastor appointed to the Continental Congress. So Witherspoon became the chaplain to the Continental Congress. It was Witherspoon who would lead them in prayer, and he was eventually a signer of the Declaration of Independence. So if you go back and you look at this famous painting of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, here you have Hancock, Jefferson, Adams, Sherman. This is John Witherspoon. And so Witherspoon had a very large influence on the Continental Congress. As America was growing during the War of American Independence, 2 of his sons fought and died. So he made his contribution eventually as, when we won the war, again, that's not a spoiler, and we're forming the Constitutional Convention. John Witherspoon was appointed delegate to the Constitutional Convention. Now, what's interesting is during this time of his political involvement, he continued to remain very active within the Presbyterian Church. He was the leader of the Pennsylvania Presbytery, and then eventually when the Presbyterians felt that they were ready to form a General Assembly, which was basically a national assembly, this met in Philadelphia. And so the first General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church met in Philadelphia in 1789. The first constitutional meeting of the United States as the United States with George Washington inaugurated was in 1789. And so John Witherspoon went from the Constitutional Convention, which was held in Independence Hall on 3rd and Walnut, walked 4 blocks to First Presbyterian Church and spoke and led the first General Assembly. So Witherspoon is a very interesting person within American history and also within the history of church in America. Just to finish with our story of John Witherspoon, Witherspoon's impact on the United States was huge. As you've seen, he was a part of the Continental Congress. He was a delegate to the Constitutional Convention. What's also interesting is that as president of what became Princeton University, he trained Madison. Madison got his degree from Princeton University. So that's why I said it's interesting if you think of Madison, was he Anglican or was he Presbyterian? It's unclear. But you can see the influence of Presbyterianism, which Madison did learn under Witherspoon, in the Federalist Papers, and you can see it in the Constitution. Madison was a firm believer in the depravity of man, of the tendency of man to exercise power. And so that's why in the Federalist Papers and in the Constitution, you see the separation of powers within the government, recognizing that man had a tendency to evil, that power tended to accelerate that tendency. So many of the forms that you see within the Constitution that are further explained in the Federalist Paper by Madison are derivatives of Madison's theology. I talked about the fact that Aaron Burr Sr. was a president of Princeton. Well, for a period of time, Aaron Burr Jr. also went to Princeton. Now, he eventually finished up at Columbia, but you've got John Witherspoon, who was influential in the training of the 4th president, of the 3rd vice president. 2 of the original Supreme Court justices were graduates under John Witherspoon, 1 Secretary of State, and over 60 congressmen, either of the initial Constitutional Convention or in years later. So John Witherspoon, as a Presbyterian pastor, had a huge, huge influence on the original formation of the United States of America. And so what are some of the things that we learned from all of this? I think one of the things that we recognize is that we need to be very careful that the idea, the First Amendment, which was penned by James Madison, was designed partly to make sure that the church and the state remain separate. Now, what they meant by that was a response to the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Participation in the government should never be dependent on a person's spiritual status. Whether or not they belonged to a church, whether or not they were baptized, whether or not they were Protestant or Catholic or Quaker, the founding fathers wanted to make sure that all religions were accepted and allowed to grow. At the same time, they all agreed that the state should never be in a position of determining theology or church leadership. And so you had this idea. And again, James Madison isn't the one who came up with it. He's the one who defended it within the Federalist Papers, wrote it during the Bill of Rights. But this was the same idea that first appeared in the Massachusetts colony, and then in Connecticut, and Rhode Island, and then in Pennsylvania. This idea that the church and the state really do need to remain separate in many areas. That neither flourished when they were entangled. And so if we ask the question, was America a Christian nation? I think one of the things that we can say is that many American institutions were founded on biblical principles. That is a true statement, but that doesn't necessarily make American Christian. You know, you look at this period of time and you had the Anglican Church growing in the South. Slavery grew in the South. You know, the modern 1619 Project wants to say that all of America was racist because it accepted slavery. Well, I don't think it's fair to say that all of America was racist, but by the same token and using the same rule, I don't know that it's fair to say that all America was Christian either. Many American institutions had biblical principles. Many of its leaders were Christian, but that doesn't make America a Christian basis. And as such, I think the other thing we recognize, and this is important for us today, is that the church should not be the basis for civil activity, nor the other way around. You know, when I've talked to people and you read some of the writings of why it's important to people that they see America as a Christian nation, part of it is because they want the safety and they want the affirmation that, hey, Christianity is legitimate. At one point, Christianity used to be important. At one point, Christian truths used to be accepted rather than ridiculed. And part of the fear, at least in some people, wanting to see America, at least historically as a Christian nation, is this idea of we want a peaceful world for the exercise of my Christianity. And there's nothing wrong with wanting to live a life of spiritual peace, but we need to recognize the government is not the guarantor of our peace, nor should it ever be such. We don't need secular affirmation to tell us that the Bible is true and that following Jesus Christ is the way to live. And it's when we look to government, it's when we look to societal acceptance for affirmation of our beliefs that we begin to run into trouble. And we're going to see that particularly next week because we're going to look at the church in America in the 1800s. And the biggest thing that happens during the 1800s is the Civil War. And the church does not have a really spotless record when it comes to how we approached slavery and racism during the Civil War. So I think we can thank God that many of the institutions, many of the habits, many of the foundational beliefs of the United States have a Christian basis, as do many of those in Europe. You know, we are not unique in that regard. But at the same time, we need to recognize that a dependence on a government approval, a dependence on this idea that somehow America is Christian, we're putting our faith in the wrong location. We are primarily Christians. We are aliens in this land. We are not citizens primarily of the United States. We are citizens primarily of the kingdom of heaven. And when we desire dual citizenship, we tend to run into problems. Any quick comments or questions? It's 10:31 and I want to end quickly so that everybody has time to get to Temple Bible Church, but I do want to give people an opportunity to ask any quick questions before we end. Okay, well, thanks everybody. I appreciate everybody.